Удобные исторические теории. Простые, стройные, известные каждому со школы. Будут опровергнуты. Забытая история.
On air is Forgotten History. The time is 3:06 p.m. This is Vladimir Karpov speaking. Today, we are joined by mathematician, associate professor at the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, and co-author of the concept, The New Chronology, Gleb Nosovsky. Hello.
Hello.
By the way, today we will focus on the origins of the term, New Chronology, and examine the calendar system, what the basis is in our usual chronology, and what you propose.
Rather, the origins of traditional chronology.
Traditional chronology. We are accustomed to counting time from the birth of Christ. If we dig a bit deeper, we will find information that the birth of Christ as a starting point was introduced somewhere in the 6th century by the Pope. That's how we have come to see ourselves in this timeline. There is the Common Era, and there is what was before the Common Era. And what do you propose?
As mathematicians, we propose to verify it. You are absolutely right in saying that it is believed that the era from the birth of Christ was introduced in the 6th century. But that is just what is believed. Furthermore, it is believed that it was introduced not just by the Pope, but by a certain monk named Dionisius Exiguus, who on the Pope's orders or perhaps on his own initiative, as it is believed, conducted certain calculations in the 6th century. Moreover, Dionisius Exiguus was a Scythian, which means he was Russian, as the Russians were called Scythians back then. So, a certain Russian monk in the 6th century calculated that very era which we use today, and which is today called the Common Era. Actually, in the West, it was long called the era of Dionysius, as well as the era from the birth of Christ. It is remarkable that not only the results of Dionisius Exiguus's calculations have survived, but also the original data on which he relied. Therefore, these calculations can simply be verified. Let's turn to these calculations. But before we discuss them, I want to point out the following. Even in the 17th century, not to mention the 16th and 15th, it was believed that the date of the birth of Christ was not established and was not exactly known, and there were many different opinions on this matter. That is, people engaged with this issue but did not reach a consensus as we have today. Today, it is believed that the date of the birth of Christ is known with an accuracy of plus or minus 4 years. Small deviations are allowed, but they are very minor. Let's look at what the Theatrum Historicum of 1680 wrote. This is a direct quote. There are many different opinions about the year in which Christ was born, and sometimes there are more than 40 such opinions. If we refer to canonical church sources, say, from the same 17th century, such as the larger Russian Catechism, it describes all the details of church dogma very thoroughly, but it does not state when Christ was born. The Gospels do not include maps or chronological tables. The Gospels only mention that it was in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. To calculate this date, one needs to refer to some chronological tables and understand when Tiberius Caesar ruled. Therefore, today many people think that the birth of Christ, approximately 15 years ago, plus or minus 4 years, is almost a church dogma, almost a part of some sacred or church-sanctified history. No, this is incorrect. The calculations of Christ's birth are relatively late calculations, as we will see, and they have nothing to do with church dogma. According to the new chronology, for hundreds of years, and according to the old chronology for over 1,000 years, the Christian Church existed without seriously considering when Christ was born. Now let's see how Dionisius Exiguus calculated the date of Christ's birth. It is known that he used the following chronological data which are preserved. For example, in the canonical church book, Syntagma Canonum, by Matthew Blasteres. It is believed that this canon law collection was written by Matthew Blasteres in the 14th century AD, in Constantinople. This is a canonical church book. It was in use up until the 17th century, and among the old believers, it is still in use. So, listen to what Blasteres writes. He has a large chapter on this topic. I am reading in Russian translation. For the Lord suffered for our salvation in the year 5539, when solar cycle was 23, lunar cycle was 10, and the Jews celebrated Passover on Saturday, March 24th. On the following Sunday, March 25th, Christ rose. The legal Jewish Passover is celebrated after the equinox on the 14th moon, that is, on the full moon, from March 21st to April 18th. Our Easter, that is, Christian, is celebrated on the following Sunday. In short, two dates are given here at once. One date is from the creation of the world, the year 5539. This roughly corresponds to our current understanding.
Is this according to the Jewish calendar?
No, this is according to the Roman Byzantine calendar. If you subtract 5508 from 5539, you get roughly 31 AD. Nevertheless, it differs. Within the framework of approximate datings, this is not so significant. Let's not dwell on this, it's a minor detail. It is approximately as stated by the Scaligerian chronology today. This is one date, but another date is immediately following. Solar cycle is 23, lunar cycle is 10, and it is said that Passover was on March 24th, and that it was not just Passover, but the Jewish Passover, which is celebrated on the full moon after the equinox. I will clarify a bit to avoid any questions. Today, Jewish Passover is celebrated slightly differently. It shifts, but in the Christian tradition, the Jewish Passover is used as the basis for calculating the Christian Easter. It is clearly stated that it is simply the first full moon after the spring equinox. This is to avoid disagreements. So, an indiction date is given. Solar and lunar cycles are given, but the indiction is omitted. However, an additional indication is given of when the first spring full moon occurred. This date allows for calculation. You can simply calculate it, and we get March 25, 1095 AD. I do not mean to say this is the actual date, but I want to say that Matthew Blasteres in the 14th century gives such a date. According to Matthew Blasteres, the resurrection of Christ was in 1095 AD. For the birth of Christ, you need to subtract 31 or 33 years, whichever you prefer. But it still comes out to the mid-11th century. It is obvious that one of the two dates was corrected because they contradict each other. Matthew Blasteres gives two dates that contradict each other. Of course, as we understand, Matthew Blasteres does not exist in the original 14th century version. These are later manuscripts in which it is very easy to correct an understandable date because the date 5539 was understood by scribes up until the 17th century. But the indiction date was not understood. An ordinary scribe, especially a medieval one, could not correct it because to understand it, one needs to perform a calculation. Today, with the help of computers, we can calculate it, but otherwise, it is completely incomprehensible. Therefore, it is generally not subject to accidental correction. If it were a random mistake, it should be noted that there are many manuscripts and editions of Matthew Blasteres, and there are never any discrepancies in this place.
In all manuscripts, in all editions, these numbers are all the same. The result we see, there were discrepancies up to the 17th century.
If Dionisius Exiguus had indeed calculated based on this data, if he had performed these calculations today with the correct astronomical parameters, he would not have obtained the date we have today. This is immediately obvious. That is, it is actually known that Dionisius made a mistake. This is well known in science, and it is believed that Dionisius made a mistake because he calculated the paschal full moons not according to exact astronomical theory, but according to the Metonic cycle, which is embedded in the Paschal tables, that is, according to the Orthodox calendar Paschal tables. He rolled back using an approximate cycle, which has an error of 1 day in 300 years. And because he calculated the Paschal full moon not by exact astronomical formulas, but approximately, he made a mistake and shifted the date.
Again, returning to what I mentioned the first time, these calculations are unstable.
Therefore, if he made a slight error in the Paschal full moon, the date immediately throws off by hundreds of years.
All right, let's dig deeper.
It is said that in the 6th century, Dionisius Exiguus calculated the birth of Christ, the one that is accepted today. But, being a monk, Dionisius Exiguus was well versed in the theory of Easter.
I will talk about this later, but for now, I won't get ahead of myself because the birth of Christ is closely linked to Easter.
Let me read it out.
Today, it is believed that Dionisius Exiguus lived in the 6th century and conducted his calculations as follows. I am quoting from the book, Calendar and Chronology, which expresses the modern point of view.
There is an assumption that when compiling his era, Dionysius took into account the tradition that Christ died in the 31st year of his life and resurrected on March 25th. The closest year in which, according to Dionysius's calculations, Easter, which he was working on, fell again on March 25th, was the year 279 of the Diocletian era.
Comparing his calculations with the Gospels, Dionysius could assume that the first Easter was celebrated 532 years ago.
That is, in fact, when calculating the birth of Christ, he also calculated the resurrection, that is, the first Easter, and used this calculation.
Moreover, it is directly considered that he calculated the resurrection, the first Easter, according to the Christian Paschal tables, Paschalian. But let's look at the Christian Paschalian. And if we go back, what does this Paschalian say about Easter in the 6th century?
It turns out that if we apply our Christian Paschalian to the 6th century, it completely violates the apostolic rules of Easter, which were always prescribed in all church councils. Everyone knew them perfectly, and they were discussed up to the 17th century and later. In fact, there are two main apostolic rules about Easter, which are believed to come from the Christ's disciples. The first rule states that Easter cannot be celebrated together with the Jews. That is, it should not coincide with the Jewish Passover.
And the second rule, Easter must be after the spring equinox.
These two rules do not unambiguously establish Easter but impose restrictions. So, if we look at the 6th century and at the modern Orthodox Paschalian, we will see that in the 6th century, there were several coincidences of Easter with the Jewish Passover. And in the 4th century, when this Paschalian was supposedly adopted at the First Council of Nicaea, there were even more coincidences. So, in fact, Dionysius in the 6th century simply could not use the Pascalian that is used today.
And this Pascalian could not even exist in the 6th century, and they say it was adopted in the 4th century. In fact, there are a huge number of problems here.
Problems with the birth of Christ, with the Pascalian, not with Easter itself, but with those Paschal tables, which are believed to have been adopted at the First Ecumenical Council supposedly in the 4th century AD.
And this is, in fact, a kind of a tangle of prejudices and gross errors on which our current understanding of calendars, the beginning of the Common Era, when it all appeared, and so on, is based.
I have a clarification. Dionysius was not the only person who attempted to work on chronology. Before him, various systems were used, such as the births of kings, wars, and the Olympic Games, as was customary in ancient Greece and later in Rome. Eventually, there is Ptolemy's canon of kings, where the list of Babylonian kings is correlated with astronomical events. And if you try to combine all of this, what do you get?
If you carefully try to combine all of this, you get a completely different chronology.
Today, I wouldn't like to talk about the entire subject, which is very extensive.
By the way, we have several books where it is described in detail. Let me mention them. There is our book with Anatoly Fomenko in the series, New Chronology for Everyone, which is simply called Easter.
And the book in the minor series, which is called Counting Years from Christ and Calendar Controversies.
These two books are specifically dedicated to the calendar issues of calculating the birth of Christ and the creation of the Paschal tables.
Additionally, in the book, Biblical Russia, we have large chapters on this topic. So, these are books specifically devoted to this subject.
Therefore, if anyone is interested and wants to delve into this in detail, we refer you to these books.
In general terms, I want to say the following.
First, the era from the birth of Christ is calculated grossly incorrectly.
This is known and proven. Second, in fact, the birth of Christ can be dated, and there is data for this.
This data can be extracted both from old calendar sources and, if using the new chronology, from Egyptian depictions.
Because there is the zodiac of Osiris, in which the date is encrypted.
This date can be deciphered, and according to the new chronology, and not only the new chronology, it has been known since the 19th century that Osiris is a duplicate of Christ.
Starting from the mid-19th century, a huge number of researchers talked about this. A huge number of parallels were found. If you use this, you can calculate this date, and there will be the dating of Christ's crucifixion. And the birth is calculated by subtracting Christ's age. In addition, there is the Star of Bethlehem. The Star of Bethlehem is one of the brightest astronomical mentions associated with the birth of Christ.
In fact, a star did flare up in the sky that quite corresponds to the descriptions of the Star of Bethlehem.
For several days it was visible even during the day, very bright.
Such a powerful star explosion happened only once, and the famous Crab Nebula was formed in the place of this explosion. In the 20th century, through precise astronomical observations of the scattering of the Crab Nebula's remnants, the date of the explosion was obtained. So, the Crab Nebula was formed in the place of the star explosion in the mid-12th century.
The zodiac of Osiris also gives the mid-12th century. Old Russian Paleas, in which the dates of the birth of Christ, his baptism, and crucifixion are indicated according to the indiction dates, also give the mid-12th century. If you carefully look at the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin, carefully, because there were some manipulations, but if you carefully look at the radiocarbon dates obtained in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, they also give the mid-12th century.
The Shroud of Turin remains a subject for discussions.
Naturally,
by itself, it proves nothing.
As evidence, I wouldn't dare to rely on it.
Naturally.
But as for, shall we say, the sequence of events, according to your words, it is the mid-12th century.
Yes, our dating is the middle of the 12th century.
I want to say that in the 14th century, in the book of Matthew of Blasteres, the date of the birth of Christ is the end of the 11th century, an error of only 100 years, which is already the result of medieval calendar calculations.
They also tried to understand chronology. I said that they were already confused about the chronology in the 14th century.
All right, if we simply return to the sequential chronology that existed, we take the same Roman emperors, and the chronology from the birth of Christ is preceded by the chronology from the era of Diocletian, the era of the martyrs, as it is called by the Copts. And according to your data, are there also incorrect calculations here?
When you say preceded, you are already using a certain historical chronological concept in which this precedes. Purely logically, to talk about chronology, about how to construct chronology, how to verify it, you must first abandon the use of existing chronologies. Otherwise, you will fall into a vicious circle. You use some moments from already existing chronological knowledge and intend to prove some chronology. It will be dependent.
What is the point of independent construction of chronology, which we call the new chronology? To build a chronology, we use nothing from old chronologies.
We look at what happens if we simply formally use astronomical and statistical data found in old sources and try to organize them, get some dates, and build a new chronological scale.
I'm still confused because you use the same old sources that you then refute yourself.
No, we use formalized sources, but we do not use their datings, which could well have been inserted in the 17th century.
After all, we mainly have manuscripts from the 17th century. And if, as historians say, it's not a 17th century manuscript, then you start to check, and even wonder. Here's an ancient text.
How did it appear? It was found in the 16th, 17th century, copied, the original disappeared.
Here's another ancient text.
How did it appear? Constantine von Tischendorf found it in the 19th century in a waste paper basket of some monastery and dated it to the 4th century.
Here's an ancient text.
Where did it come from? It surfaced in some papers in the 19th century, and so on.
No, if we are to prove it, then let's prove it.
If it's an ancient text, let's see if it's ancient or not. Let's provide some proof.
And when you get to the evidence,
that's where the most interesting part begins.
Let's turn to the charters and documents that originated from rulers. Today, libraries contain many supposedly authentic charters from great princes, Western emperors, and so on.
Regarding the Western ones, there was Wilhelm Kammeyer, a German lawyer, who thoroughly investigated the so-called original documents, charters of the emperors, and proved that all of them are forgeries. This was a major work he conducted throughout the 20th century.
He wrote several books on this topic.
We also dealt with this issue and discovered that there are as many as 3 spiritual wills of Ivan Kalita today. There are charters originating from Ivan III.
They can be examined.
But as soon as you start looking at them, a lot of puzzling questions immediately arise. These are important documents, charters originating from a ruler.
This is an important document that could have been used far from the royal court to assert some rights.
Therefore, from the very beginning, these charters were carefully protected, and there were special degrees of protection for such documents.
Today, we have Gleb Nosovsky with us, a mathematician, associate professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics at Moscow State University, co-author of the concept, the new chronology. We are trying to figure out what the Nativity of Christ actually is. By the way, we haven't asked you the main question yet. According to your information and calculations, what is the current year from the birth of Christ, if we take that as the starting point?
We need to subtract 1152, but that's approximate.
2015 minus 1152?
Yes, it will be 860 something. You can calculate it.
Again, I have to clarify some data. Alright, there is the modern chronology, but there are many peoples who count from the creation of the world in their traditions. Take the Jews, for example. We can move to somewhere like Thailand, where it's the year 6000 something. How do these data correlate?
I already mentioned the first time that dates from the creation of the world are introduced from ancient starting points.
It's always like that. We shouldn't think that if, for example, it's now year 7500 something from the creation, people have counted each year from the creation and reached 7000.
And 2015 was not counted from the birth of Christ, as we know.
Adhering to traditional chronology, I used to think that this is such a historical memory of a particular people, after which they start their chronology.
No, that's incorrect.
The first time, I explained in detail that the introduction of the era was purely a chronological measure and very justified to transition from unstable ways of counting years to stable ones.
An era is a stable way of counting years.
Eras were always introduced from an ancient point. That is, we did not start counting from the first year but said, let's start counting from the year 5000, from the year 4000, and so on.
So, it is still a very conditional date?
It is a very conditional date, just as today, we say, the Common Era. It began 2015 years ago, and we all count by it.
It's convenient to count this way, everyone is used to it, and this is how we count in the new chronology.
It's just a certain conditional point.
Alright, now we'll take calls from our listeners.
I wanted to summarize what I said the first time. So, traditional chronology is based on the interpretation of the information available today.
Interpretation includes, in particular, the distribution of sources, documents, and charters into correct and incorrect ones.
Because there are also incorrect ones, as they are called, products of ignorance, and so on. The distribution into true and false, correct and incorrect, the distribution of all this over time, and so on.
This is a certain historical chronological concept introduced, as is well known, in the 16th–17th centuries by Scaliger and Petavius, as they are called, the founders of scientific chronology.
The new chronology is an independent investigation of the same historical information, separate from this chronology.
The information is the same, but independently of the chronological tables of Scaliger and Petavius, we try to extract dates from it using modern scientific methods. As a result, a completely different historical chronological picture emerges, in which, in particular, correct and incorrect, ignorant and competent documents, forgeries and originals are arranged differently.
This includes the introduction of the Common Era, the modern calendar. All this was introduced within the framework, as is believed, of the Catholic Church of the 16th–17th centuries. I want to quote the official statement of the Catholic Church from March 5, 1616, which is the 17th century.
The proposition that the sun is stationary at the center of the universe is foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. The proposition that the earth moves and is not at the center of the universe receives the same judgment in philosophy, and in regard to theological truth, it is at least erroneous in faith.
This is the year 1616. In 1601, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake.
In the 17th century, Galileo was persecuted.
We say, this is wrong, they were mistaken.
But at the same time, the same people were introducing chronology.
Scaliger was involved in all this activity. He was an advisor to the Pope. They introduced the chronology. They introduced the new Gregorian calendar. And it is believed that these calculations were done correctly.
So, I want to say that even a cursory glance at what so-called knowledge they possessed at that time already makes one doubt this, and at the very least creates a desire to double-check what they did back then.
I have one last important clarification. If they made mistakes, do you admit that you could also be mistaken?
Anyone can make mistakes. We are scientists. We rely on the methods of modern science. Yes, of course, mistakes are possible in science.
But today, science has reached a fairly high level.
I want to say that our research is at the current level of scientific development. Of course, some mistakes are possible, just as errors are possible in the calculations of airplanes, bridges, and so on.
But the currently accepted modern version of chronology is at the level of the 16th–17th century science. That's what's important.
I suggest we start taking calls now.
Yes, let's do that.
You'll need headphones. We are listening to you. Hello.
Alexander Sergeyevich, Moscow. Gleb Vladimirovich, I am a true and even zealous admirer of you and Anatoly Fomenko. Kindest greetings.
Very nice.
Gleb Vladimirovich, maybe you have or haven't covered the question. I haven't followed today's broadcast very closely. In regard to the personality of our Savior, Jesus Christ, do you expand this topic in any way?
Regarding Christ,
We have written a lot about Christ, about dating his life, about what new understanding of Christ and his era is given by the new chronology, which allows us to bring in data that was previously considered unrelated to Christ.
we have written several books on this topic. In general, these questions are covered in many books, but the main one is Tsar of the Slavs, which is dedicated to dating Christ's era and a detailed study of Christ's era and his actions. Recently, we also released the book God of War, which is also dedicated to the Holy Family. We will also publish The Last Journey of the Holy Family, which will be dedicated to the decline of the Holy Family, to which Christ belonged. So, these are actually huge and very interesting topics.
In short, I want to say that according to the new chronology, Christ belonged to the ancient royal family of the empire, which created our civilization. This family created the empire, the statehood that we all use today. But in the 14th century, this family was pushed out of power and moved east, creating many Eastern empires there.
But this was already after Christ. According to the new chronology, Christ lived and acted in the 12th century AD and was emperor of this single empire for 3 years. I repeat, in the new chronology, there is only one empire, not many as in the current version of history, where there are many different empires. They interact with each other somehow.
But in the new chronology, from the very beginning, from the dawn of our history until the early 17th century, there was one empire, which then indeed split into many independent states.
Mila is interested. Then in what century did the Prophet Muhammad and Islam arise? The 11th century plus 6 centuries, in the 17th century, or what?
No, of course, the chronology compresses. It is clear that the current chronology is greatly stretched.
Christ is placed in the 1st century, and Muhammad is placed in the 7th. When we compress all this and bring it in line with the new chronology, the sequence of events is preserved, but the intervals are compressed. Christ falls in the mid-12th century, and Muhammad falls in the 15th century.
There, he is identified with a very famous figure in Russian chronicles, the Golden Horde Khan Ullah Muhammad or Great Muhammad, who left central Russia and founded Kazan. This is what is attributed to Muhammad today, the flight from Mecca to Medina.
According to the new chronology, Kazan is Medina. We found the Kaaba there. I refer to our book called The Prophet Conqueror, where Moses walked. This and other books talk a lot about Muhammad. We always return to this most important subject. The personality of Muhammad is very vivid. And the last thing I want to say on this topic.
This is little known, but nonetheless. Last summer, there was an exhibition at the State Historical Museum, where they finally displayed the ceremonial helmet of Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov.
This is the mid-17th century.
They date this helmet to the 1650s.
In this warrior helmet, Alexei Mikhailovich would appear before the people and conduct solemn services.
There is a nasal guard with an inscription at the top.
On the forehead of the Russian Tsar Alexei Romanov, in large letters the inscription says, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet."
There is another version, according to which our blacksmiths simply copied the Arabic script to create a certain ornament. They copied a fragmentary phrase, in which "there is no God but" is repeated many times, and there is also something unfinished. Didn't you consider this?
As for Alexei Mikhailovich's helmet, it has a fully canonical and complete phrase written on it, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet." If translated literally from Arabic, it is, "There is no God but the true God, and Muhammad is the messenger of the true God."
This is usually translated as, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet." It is written without any abbreviations or additions, very prominently on the forehead of Alexei Mikhailovich.
So, do you rule out mere copying?
I do not want to interpret now. I just want to say that the historian's assumption that supposedly, without knowing the Arabic language, the Russians copied something, seems extremely doubtful to me.
Because, in fact, among the Russian nobility of the 17th century, Arabic was known just as well as Greek.
They knew foreign languages.
By the way, this is reflected in Moscow's names.
For example, Arbat Street is an Arabic word.
Why is the Kutafia Tower called Kutafia? What do you think? Because scribes sat there.
This is the Arabic word Ketova, Kutafia Tower. Another well-known word is rinda. In Russia, the Tsar's bodyguards were called rindas. Rinda is an Arabic word meaning close person.
There are many Arabic words in the Old Russian court language. Therefore, the idea that in the 16th–17th century the Russian nobility, I am not talking about peasants, did not know the Arabic language is absolutely incorrect.
For example, when the same Alexei Mikhailovich granted, for example, some sabers, granted weapons, it was usually written on the weapons in Arabic.
There are examples of granted sabers of Alexei Mikhailovich, where it is written in Arabic, "Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich grants this saber."
I know an alternative version regarding rinda, referring to the ship's bell, according to which our sailors abbreviated the English phrase, "ring the bell," as rinda bay.
No, that's a different word. We are talking about different words.
They sound similar, but they are different words.
All right. We are listening to you carefully. Hello.
Hello, good afternoon.
Yes, you are on the air. Please go ahead.
I wanted to ask a question. My name is Maxime.
Yes, hello.
Unfortunately, I didn't listen to your broadcast from the beginning. I liked the dating of the Nativity of Christ related to the explosion of a supernova, the Crab Nebula. I would like to ask your guest if there are any other astronomical events whose dating can be accurately determined using modern astronomical research methods?
That would confirm your chronology, please.
Yes, there are quite a few. We have an entire book dedicated to the dating of the Almagest, specifically the oldest part of the Almagest, based on observations of bright stars in the sky included in the star catalogue of the Almagest.
They provide an interval from year 600 to 1300 AD, with an average value around the year 1000 AD.
This is the dating of the oldest part of the Almagest. There is the dating of the zodiac of astronomy in the Vatican, which depicts the development of the Ptolemaic system of the world and gives the date 1228, the 13th century.
I remind you that historians date these events to the 2nd century AD. In addition, there are many Egyptian and European zodiacs.
There are zodiacs in Turkey, and there are many zodiacs in Italy. The aggregate dating of these zodiacs shows that, for example, the ancient Egyptian history known today and leaving us monuments, unfolded from the 10th to the 15th century AD.
This was the heyday of ancient Egyptian history.
The current version of Italian history is absolutely incorrect. The medieval Italian history is generally shifted, and all dates are shifted 100, 200, 300 years forward. That is, what they date to the 13th, 14th centuries is actually the 16th, sometimes the 17th, and sometimes even the 18th century.
We have dated many such astronomical data,
and the resulting picture is presented in our books. New Chronology of Egypt, Ancient Zodiacs of Egypt and Europe, Egyptian, Russian, Italian zodiacs.
By the way,
There are Russian zodiacs. They can be used to date the birthday of Ivan the Terrible. Additionally, we have a book, Vatican, dedicated to the dating of zodiacs.
we are also writing a new book tentatively titled Roxolana. There are also many Italian zodiacs, which reveal the history of the 16th century.
We have many astronomical datings, and this is an important segment of the new chronology.
Nikolai is interested. Then there must be a general error in the chronology calculations in Egypt, Europe, India, China, and in America too with their Maya.
There cannot be a common error because it is not a rigid shift of the entire chronology, it is also being compressed.
Therefore, of course, the error is not common, but there are several main shifts.
The picture is not that simple. One should not think that we take our historical picture and just rigidly shift it by a certain number of years into the future.
No, it doesn't work that way.
Different events are shifted by different amounts, but common shifts have been found for large blocks of historical events. Anatoly Fomenko discovered three main shifts in Roman European history of 330, 780, and 1,800 years back in the late 70s and early 80s.
I believe Karl Popper proposed three criteria for a scientific theory: verifiability, falsifiability, and the third criterion, conformity to Occam's razor principle. Have you tested your theory against these criteria?
We are mathematicians, not philosophers. We, mathematicians, have different criteria. Our criteria are proofs.
Hello, you are on the air. Please go ahead.
Please tell me, what about the dates of lunar eclipses then? Plato calculated them according to certain rules. So, he had to first build a system of dates in such a way as to restore the chronology of eclipses, and only then create the contemporary theory of lunar eclipses for that time.
Thank you. Accepted.
This is a very good question, but it's not Plato, it's Ptolemy. We have carefully studied all the eclipses mentioned in the Almagest.
Indeed, it mentions quite a few lunar eclipses, and these eclipses show that the chronology was falsified.
Why are lunar eclipses bad for researching chronology?
They are bad because the fact, not the phase of the lunar eclipse, is calculated according to Ptolemy theory.
In addition, a lunar eclipse is visible from half of the Earth, so the location is also irrelevant. Therefore, lunar eclipses by themselves are useless.
Attempts to calculate lunar eclipses are old.
As I said, according to the new chronology, Ptolemy theory was developed in the 13th century.
Therefore, if the exact phase of the lunar eclipse is not indicated, or at least if it was a total eclipse, it is quite useless material for chronology. However, if the exact phases are indicated, whether it is a total eclipse or something specific, then yes, this is valuable material.
All such lunar eclipses with indicated phases or sequences of lunar eclipses at certain intervals of time, the so-called Thucydides triad, have been investigated by us, and they all give medieval dates. This was also noticed by Morozov. Another notable remark, also not ours but from Morozov, when he studied the Almagest, he noticed that the Almagest does not mention a single solar eclipse. There are many lunar eclipses but not a single solar one. He posed a fair question. After all, a solar eclipse is the most striking event. Lunar eclipses happen quite often, and they are not very noticeable. But a fairly complete solar eclipse is a bright event that immediately attracts people's attention.
So, over all these thousands of years, you didn't include a single solar eclipse in the Almagest, which was the main textbook.
Morozov rightly wrote,
"This is evidence that the Almagest was edited in the 17th century, and those astronomical observations that could potentially cause doubts about Scaliger's chronology in the future were removed from it. Because they could verify lunar eclipses using Ptolemy theory, calculate them retrospectively, and insert them into the Almagest in the 17th century. But they couldn't calculate solar eclipses in the 17th century because it's a delicate matter, with a narrow strip of shadow, and it is necessary to calculate that the shadow passed precisely through a specific place.
This is a very fine matter,
and they began to calculate solar eclipses only in the 19th century. But in the 17th century, people were not foolish. They understood that someday solar eclipses could be calculated and that these were pieces of evidence that needed to be destroyed.
Therefore, there is not a single solar eclipse in the Almagest.
We have time for one more call. We are listening to you. Hello.
Good evening, gentlemen. The Catholic holiday of Christmas is approaching. Why is there a 2-week difference between Catholic Christmas and Orthodox Christmas? There are the Gregorian and Julian calendars. Don't you think that the advent of Catholicism and disagreements with true Christianity signify the arrival of Satan?
We have a non-religious program, but the question about the Julian and Gregorian calendars is accepted.
This is a very interesting question, and I want to dedicate the next broadcast to it. It is not that simple and is actually very interesting.
Right now, I won't be able to answer it in just 2 minutes.
Next time, I will explain in detail.
Then next week, we will talk about the differences between the Julian and Gregorian calendars. Now we have time for one more call. We are listening to you. Hello.
Good afternoon. The question is very short. On your radio station, Mikhail Hazin said that the sewer system in Paris was built in 1850. It is known that there was a sewer system in ancient Rome. How does your guest, or perhaps you, view the idea that civilization is constantly developing, or that it can fall so much that it forgets how to build a sewer system? Thank you.
About decline, revival, and so on.
This is a completely correct question.
There was a sewer system in ancient Rome, but according to the new chronology, ancient Rome is not that ancient.
Money appeared in Paris, and it became a major capital only in the 17th century, and they grew to build a sewerage in the 18th century.
Well, I remind our listeners that today we had with us mathematician, associate professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, co-author of the concept, The New Chronology, Gleb Nosovsky. Thank you. Come again.
Thank you.